Hello everyone and welcome back to the lesson. The subject is advanced taxation. We continue with the topic tax systems and policies. In our today's lesson, we're going to study design of a tax policy. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain the key elements to consider in designing a tax policy. The key elements to consider in designing a tax policy. That is our today's lesson. And candidates, designing a tax policy involves complex interplay of economic, social, and political considerations. It is an interplay of social, political, and economic considerations. And crafting an effective tax policy requires balancing the objectives of revenue generation, fairness, economic growth, and also the administrative feasibility. So when crafting a tax policy, then it's important to put into consideration. It is important to balance the objectives of revenue collection, the objectives of fairness, the objective of economic growth, and also administrative feasibility. So what are the key elements that ought to be considered in the design of a tax policy? Elements to consider. Now, the first element, obviously, is clear objectives and goals. Number one, if a tax policy is to be designed, then it has to begin with objectives. What are the goals? What are the objectives? The objectives and goals must be clearly defined. Define specific goals. All right? One, or the government has to define the specific goals in order to achieve the purpose, or in order to come up with an effective tax policy. Define the specific goals the tax policy intends to achieve, such as revenue generation, such as equity, such as economic growth, and so on. Specific objectives. Number two, equity and fairness has to be considered. Equity and fairness. It's important to assess the fairness of the tax policy by considering progressive, proportional, or even regressive tax structures. Fairness. Then it is also critical to determine who bears the burden. Who should bear the burden of tax? So that's an element to consider. Who is going to bear the burden of tax and ensure that the distribution of the burden aligns with social values and social goals. Equity and fairness has to be considered when designing a tax policy. 3, economic impact. Economic impact and efficiency. Economic impact and efficiency. Consider the potential impact of taxes on the economic behavior of the members of the society. So when designing a tax policy, then one ought to strive for a tax policy that minimizes distortions and what we call deadweight loss in order to promote efficiency. When designing a tax policy, it's important to analyze the economic impact of such a policy. It's important to analyze the economic efficiency of such a tax policy. Then it's also crucial to balance the need for revenue with minimizing and at the same time minimizing the impact of taxes on investment, on savings, and also consumption. Those are economic factors. Balance the need for revenue and minimize the impact of taxes on investment and consumption. Assess the economic impact and efficiency of tax policy. 4, simplicity and clarity. Simplicity and clarity. When designing a tax policy, aim for a tax code that is easy to understand and comply with for both the taxpayers and the tax authority. It has to be simple, it has to be clear to both the taxpayers and the tax authority, so that complexity in tax laws, because complexity in tax laws can lead to compliance issues and administrative burdens. So a tax policy should not be complex because it can generate into compliance problems. People may not comply. The tax authority may also have administrative burdens. So it's important that a tax policy be simple and clear to understand. 5, revenue adequacy. Revenue adequacy. It's important to consider revenue adequacy. All right? Revenue adequacy. When designing a tax policy, consider the revenue adequacy and stability. Revenue adequacy and stability. Ensure that the tax policy generates sufficient revenue to fund government expenditures while maintaining fiscal stability. Also evaluate the predictability and stability of revenue streams over time. It's important to consider all that when designing a tax policy. Number 6, consider balanced tax mix. Consider a balanced tax mix. That means that there ought to be diversity of tax base to reduce reliance on any single tax source. Balance, mix. Balance, mix. That also means that there ought to be a mix of taxes. Consider a mix of taxes. Consider mix of taxes like income, taxes on income, taxes on consumption, taxes on property, in order to distribute the tax burden across various segments of the economy. That's what ought to be done when designing a tax policy, so that no single sector of economy carries a larger burden than the other aspects of the economy. Balanced tax mix. 7, when designing a tax policy, consider administrative feasibility. Consider administrative feasibility. That means assessing the administrative feasibility and the cost effectiveness of implementing the proposed tax policy. It also means evaluating the capacity of tax authorities to enforce and administer the tax policy. Does the Revenue Authority have the administrative capacity to administer this tax policy? That is a factor to consider. 8, adaptability. And flexibility. Adaptability and flexibility. That means designing the tax policy to be adaptable to changes in the economy, changes in technology, and even social needs. It also may mean allowing for flexibility in making adjustments without causing significant disruptions in the economy. Adaptability and flexibility. 9, public engagement and participation. Public engagement and participation. That means involving the stakeholders and the public in the tax policy formulation process in order to ensure transparency, in order also to ensure what we call legitimacy. Involve the stakeholders, involve the members of the public in order to ensure legitimacy. You understand? It may also involve, this also may mean communicating the rationale and the implications of the tax policy to gain public support and compliance. Communicate to the public. The 10th element is evaluation. Evaluation. And review mechanisms. Evaluation and review mechanisms. That means establishing mechanisms for regular review, for regular evaluation, for regular review and evaluation of the tax policy, for regular review of the effectiveness of the tax policy, for regular evaluation and review for the effectiveness in achieving its objectives. That may also mean adjusting the policy as needed based on empirical data and feedback. So candidates, these are 10 factors or elements to put into consideration when designing a tax policy. Number 1, clear objectives. Number 2, equity and fairness. Number 3, economic impact and efficiency. Number 4, simplicity and clarity. Number 5, revenue adequacy and stability. Number 6, balanced tax mix. Number 7, administrative feasibility. Number 8, adaptability and flexibility. Number 9, public engagement and participation. Then lastly, evaluation and review mechanisms. 9 elements that ought to be considered when designing a tax policy. And candidates, in conclusion, designing of a tax policy involves careful balancing act among competing interests, among competing objectives. And it requires a thorough understanding of economic principles. It requires a thorough understanding of social considerations, as well as administrative capabilities or capacities and political realities within the given context. And a successful tax policy design often involves a compromise and iterative adjustments to achieve the desired outcomes while minimizing what we call unintended consequences. So that will mark the end of our today's lesson. And as it is our custom, I'm going to give you an assignment. I'll read the 4 questions. Here is the assignment: designing of a tax policy. Number 1, what are the key considerations that policymakers should weigh when designing a progressive tax policy? How do these considerations differ for a regressive tax policy? Number 2, explain the concept of tax elasticity and its significance in designing effective tax policies. Provide examples illustrating how elasticity affects tax design. 3, how can tax policy be structured to encourage sustainable environmental policies or practices while generating revenue for the government? Discuss potential challenges and benefits. Number 4, discuss the importance of transparency and simplicity in a tax policy. How can policymakers ensure these elements are integrated into the design and implementation of taxes? Thank you for attending the lesson. I'll see you in our next session, where we continue to share knowledge regarding tax policy and systems. Bye.